Sony does not need to pretend Venom ended cleanly because the movie already left the door open. The Last Dance was sold as a final chapter, and Tom Hardy along with Kelly Marcel had already said the trilogy was always meant to end after 3 films, but the movie still kept the symbiote mythology alive through that mid-credits null tease and the post-credits survival crumb with the symbiote fragment. At the same time, Sony's wider Spider-Man villain experiment has been a mess compared with Venom's run, with Madame Web finishing around 100 million worldwide and Kraven landing at about 62 million worldwide, while The Last Dance still reached about 480 million worldwide. That is exactly why the next move matters so much, because Sony does not just need another sequel, it needs a new lane, and the biggest sign that Sony already knows this is the animated Venom movie now in development with Zach Lipovsky and Adam Stein, the Final Destination Bloodlines duo. That report is not some random rumor mill noise either. It has been confirmed by major trades in early 2026, and it tells you a lot about the tone Sony might be chasing. These are filmmakers who understand tension, escalation, and how to make genre material feel dangerous instead of disposable. In other words, Sony is not just looking for a quick cash grab, it is testing whether Venom can survive as a darker, more controlled brand outside the Hardy live-action format. What makes that even more interesting is the wider Spider-Man strategy Sony is pushing right now. Spider-Noir starring Nicolas Cage launched on Prime Video, and Spider-Man Brand New Day is officially on the calendar for July 31st. On top of that, Beyond the Spider-Verse is officially dated for June next year, so Sony is not done with Spider-Man adjacent storytelling at all. It is just shifting away from the old villain universe model and toward projects that either have a stronger creative identity or are tethered to a proven Spider-Man core. That is the real context for any Venom 4 conversation. That is why the most logical next step is not to keep chasing Eddie Brock exactly as he was, but to evolve the symbiote into a new host and a new genre. The cleanest version of Venom 4 is Agent Venom. And honestly, this is the one that feels like Sony could sell to both comic fans and casual audiences without having to explain a ton of multiverse baggage. In Marvel's own lore, Flash Thompson goes from high school bully to war hero to agent anti-Venom, with the symbiote turning him into a government-backed weapon after he loses his legs in combat. That is a perfect movie setup because it gives the franchise a human hook, a military angle, and a built-in emotional reason for the symbiote to return. If Sony went that route, the movie could feel completely different from the Hardy trilogy in the best way. Instead of a loose buddy comedy monster movie, you could get something closer to a Black Ops thriller with symbiote horror baked in. Flash would not just be carrying the suit, he would be using it like a tactical upgrade while slowly realizing that the thing he is leaning on is also keeping him unstable. That opens the door for a villain like Jack-O-Lantern or Crime Master, the kind of street-level criminal chaos that can pull the story back down to earth while still letting the symbiote do insane things on screen. It would also let Sony keep the Venom name alive without pretending Tom Hardy can just show up forever and carry the whole thing on his back. Another path that feels even bigger is Dylan Brock. Marvel's own profile makes it clear that Dylan is not just Eddie's kid in name only. He is literally tied to the symbiote codex and has the ability to affect the hive mind connection to Null. That is a massive amount of story fuel. If Sony wants to keep the Brock name in the franchise, without forcing Hardy back into the center, Dylan is the cleanest inheritance play. It lets the studio keep the emotional legacy of Eddie Brock while shifting the point of view to a younger hero who can grow into the role. That version of Venom 4 could play like dark fantasy, not just superhero action, with Dylan trying to master a legacy that is bigger and scarier than he is. And once you go Dylan, Null becomes the obvious endgame. Marvel describes Null as the god of symbiotes, and the King in Black story is exactly the kind of cosmic event that can turn a Venom sequel into a full-blown apocalypse movie. That is especially relevant because The Last Dance already introduced Null as the big bad in a way that clearly was not meant to be a one-off joke. Even if Sony never goes full comic book accuracy, the movie version of Null is already the sort of villain who can justify a massive scale-up. The trick is that Sony would need to make him feel mythic instead of just noisy, because once a villain like that is on the table, every symbiote story gets bigger overnight. Then there is the Carnage angle, which is still too juicy to ignore. Marvel's official Absolute Carnage material makes the premise brutally clear, because Cletus Cassidy comes back as a symbiote-powered nightmare targeting basically everyone who has ever worn a symbiote. That is the kind of story Sony could absolutely turn into a horror-leaning sequel or a spin-off event if it wants something nastier than the usual comic book formula. The beautiful part is that Carnage does not need to be treated as dead forever. In the comics, death is usually just a pause button for Cletus, and Sony has already shown enough flexibility with its symbiote lore that a resurrection arc would not feel out of place at all. That is where the movie logic gets really fun, because Sony could tie several pieces together instead of picking only one. The Last Dance already left behind a surviving symbiote fragment, and the movie also introduced a symbiote-centered support cast that could be reused if the studio wants to keep the world feeling connected. That means a future film could bring back a character like Patrick Mulligan, or bring in a new host like Dr. Teddy Payne's symbiote setup, and slowly build toward a larger symbiote war rather than jumping straight into another Eddie-centered story. The key is that Sony now has enough loose threads to make the next movie feel like a continuation without pretending it is a direct sequel in the old sense. My read is that Sony's smartest move is a soft reset, not a hard erase. That means keeping the symbiote mythology, keeping the brand value, but changing the host, the tone, and the stakes. Agent Venom is the most commercially safe version. Dylan Brock is the most comic book epic version. Carnage is the most horror-driven version. Null is the big cosmic endgame if Sony wants to go full monster mythology. And the reason all of those options feel more alive now than they did a year ago is because the rest of Sony's Spider-Man strategy is finally pointing in a more coherent direction, with Spider-Noir, Spider-Verse, and the new Tom Holland Spider-Man movie all giving the brand stronger anchors than the old villain universe ever had. If Sony really wants Venom 4 to matter, the movie has to feel like a reinvention rather than a contract extension. The Hardy era worked because Hardy committed to the bit so hard that audiences kept showing up. But the next era will need more than that. It will need a sharper identity, a better villain, and a reason to exist in a post-Hardy world. But there is another possibility that might actually be the most interesting one because it connects Venom back to the biggest missing piece of the entire story: Spider-Man himself. For years, Sony has been dancing around the obvious. Venom is one of Spider-Man's greatest enemies, but the live-action movies spent an entire trilogy avoiding the relationship that made the character legendary in the first place. And after the events of No Way Home, the door is technically open. Eddie briefly entered the MCU, and even though he never met Peter, the symbiote instantly recognized Spider-Man through the hive mind connection. Then a piece of the symbiote was left behind in the MCU timeline. That small moment might end up being much bigger than fans originally thought. Because if Marvel and Sony want to finally introduce a darker Venom story into the MCU, they already planted the seed. The interesting thing is that Sony does not necessarily need to bring back Tom Hardy to make that happen. The symbiote is not just a character, it is an alien species with memories and instincts. That means another version of Venom could exist with completely different personality traits depending on the host. Eddie was emotional, chaotic, and basically became the symbiote's best friend. But imagine the same creature bonding with someone colder, more disciplined, or even someone with a darker past. A story like that would also allow Sony to explore something the previous films only touched on: the danger of the symbiote itself. In the Hardy trilogy, Venom was mostly portrayed as an alien roommate with violent tendencies. But the original comic version was much scarier. It changes your emotions, feeds your anger, and slowly blurs the line between you and the creature living inside you. A new movie could finally lean into that psychological horror. And this is where Null becomes even more important, because Null is not just another villain waiting in the background. He is basically the reason symbiotes exist in the first place. His connection to the symbiote species means that every Venom story eventually leads back to him. If Sony introduces him properly, he could become the equivalent of Thanos for the symbiote corner of Marvel. But the biggest mistake Sony could make would be rushing him. A lot of superhero movies fail because they introduce the biggest villain before the audience actually understands why that villain matters. Null should not just arrive with a giant army and destroy planets. The movie needs to build the mythology first. Show that the symbiotes are connected. Show that Venom was only one piece of something much larger. A possible Venom 4 could even work as a bridge movie. The first half could introduce a new host, maybe Flash or Dylan Brock, while the second half slowly reveals that something bigger is coming. The symbiote fragment left on Earth starts changing. Other symbiotes begin appearing. Strange things happen. And then the audience realizes this is not another random alien invasion. It is the beginning of the King in Black. There is also the possibility that Sony could use this opportunity to finally bring in more symbiotes from the comics. Characters like Anti-Venom have huge potential. The Last Dance already proved audiences are willing to accept multiple symbiotes on screen, but the next step would be giving them actual personalities instead of just making them monsters fighting in the background. At the same time, Sony has to be careful not to repeat the same mistake they made with the Spider-Man universe. The future of Venom probably is not about making another movie exactly like the first three. It is about understanding why Venom became popular in the first place. The character works because he is a contradiction. That conflict is what can carry another decade of stories.